It's important to be able to forecast because that's how you're going to base inventory. That's how you're going to base hiring. That's how you're going to know exactly where you're at cash flow wise. That's all extremely important, especially if you don't have billions of dollars to draw on.
Welcome back, everybody. My name is Rekuc Nelson with Common Thread Collective, and he's back. The data chef, the data guru, the data goat, whatever you want to call him, Steve Rekuc. He's got some amazing insights for us today, and I don't want to waste any time. I know you've got something around CAC, spend. I really want to dive into this.
Yeah. So this started a little while ago when one of our growth strategists, Luke Austin, came to me and asked me to plot out CAC versus spend for a few of the different clients because they notice CAC goes up as spend goes up. Essentially, as you're spending more money, you pick the lowest hanging fruit first with the first spend that you have on a lot of ad platforms. But then as you're ramping up spend, particularly as you scale a lot more, you're picking higher hanging fruit and your CAC is increasing as spend increases. And they've noticed this, and we plotted that out on a graph and showed the correlation for different brands. We did that for a few different brands, particularly for the larger brands we were working with. We found this pretty good correlation where as spend goes up, cost of acquiring those customers goes up. So as you're scaling, it becomes a little more expensive to scale.
This is that whole idea of decreasing efficiency, right?
Yeah, absolutely. It's decreasing efficiency that we're seeing as you're trying to push and scale more.
My thought with this is it's common knowledge that, okay, hey, if you're going to spend more, your CAC will increase. Was the point of this to get data proof behind that?
Yeah, you're correct. That was like the number one thing was to verify this, that, okay, as we're spending more, our cost of acquiring customers is going up. And we pretty much see that across the board. It's how closely it's tied, as well as how steep that curve is, will vary between different brands.
I think that's one thing people love about the work that you do here is that it's not opinions. You never come out of the woodworks like, hey, I was meditating and I decided that spend and CAC are highly correlated, especially when people watch this. Oh, I already knew this. This isn't about whether you knew it or not knew it. This is about actually having proof that this exists.
You can have hypotheses, but check them out. Let the data back up what you believe.
So let's look at the outliers in this chart here. That's where my attention immediately jumped. Can you explain what this relationship, like if it holds in these different spaces, what does this mean?
If you're looking on the upper left in the chart, essentially CAC increased a lot without spend necessarily increasing as much as it normally does to warrant that increase in CAC. And the upper left actually, and if we look at apparel brand 2 in this one specifically, in those two circled outliers up there, those actually occurred the 2 weeks prior to the bottom right ones. So I know that was something that we have said for holidays or like peak moments for brands a lot of times is that will increase spend prior to that moment to try and drive a little bit more impressions, a little bit more awareness. So then when you do reach that holiday moment, one of the 4 peaks that we've talked about, whether it's Black Friday, Cyber Monday that we just passed, or an upcoming holiday that's pertinent to your brand, you'd want to increase spend before so you get more impressions prior to having a really successful next week.
So CAC was up in this time, in this period, but spend actually wasn't up. So I'm paying more, but I'm still spending the same amount. But you're saying in certain times, especially when you're coming into those peak moments, you may want to continue spending or even increase spend, even though your CAC is higher, because you will reach this bottom right area, which is like the space where every brand wants to be, right?
Exactly. You want to be in that space where you're scaling spend and yet your CAC is not increasing, where you're essentially able to scale without kind of hitting those inefficiencies. And that's one way of going about it is to spend more the previous week. And it may be at a increased cost of acquiring those customers, but then in the future, the next week, you're able to capitalize on that.
One thing I wanted to do was really put this in the context of 2023. We've seen so many dramatic changes happen over the last year, and we saw the impact of forecasting and what an improper forecast can do to a company, to an economy, to 11,000 employees being laid off at Facebook. And we've seen it all throughout the industry. So when we talk about what to do with this data, being able to point where, hey, this is where we want to be, this is what we're up against.
Yeah, knowing what you're up against, knowing the e-commerce terrain essentially is important.
Yes, yes.
Having a good model of this can hopefully help our brands have a decent understanding of what kind of CAC they would have. So as they're trying to acquire more customers and spend, they have an understanding of where they would sit in terms of how much they spend versus how many customers they acquire.
How do we know when we're actually going into a peak moment or if we're just not doing good?
Hopefully it's a scheduled peak moment, one that you
Mm.
understand and identify and is pertinent to your brand. At CTC going into 2023, we have brands that will have big cultural moments, maybe on Martin Luther King Day, maybe on Valentine's Day. So there's a lot of different holidays. In fact, CTC has a calendar, I think, of over 400 different holidays, special days that you could use, that might speak to your brand's audience.
Yeah, we'll link that calendar in the description as well so you all can check that out. And that's the part with forecasting that I think is really important. You just hit it right on the head, is planned peak moments. Like peak moments you can actually look forward to in advance as opposed to unexpected. Let's say we get into a moment where we're getting into that danger zone in the top left, but you're not approaching a peak moment. Is there something you've seen correlated with that? Is it just high CPMs?
I mean, there's a variety of things that could affect that. As you're pointing out, the quality of ads and the strategy of the campaigns. The other thing that we saw was correlated really well was consumer confidence. Somebody asked me, does CAC always go up like that? I'm like, actually, no, but it happened at the same time that consumer confidence is going down. So similar to the conversation we had about MER, if consumer confidence is dropping, it would seem pretty intuitive that it's going to be harder to convince customers to purchase your product for the first time. It's going to cost more to acquire those customers. CAC will go up as consumer confidence goes down. I found it inversely related. It was in the negative correlation was 0.826, which is fairly strong. That, hey, as consumers are less confident, they're less likely to try your product out.
As a person who is very much on the creative, marketing, sales, the territory doesn't define us. These are the reasons we must succeed. You take 100% responsibility, don't blame. I think it's easy to push away the importance of this data. Oh, it doesn't matter. Consumer confidence is always going to be going crazy. We need to consistently go up to the right. But I think when I hear what you're saying, and even the way you share the data, and our context is actually being a advertiser in the industry, is not saying, hey, you should stop advertising, you should go hide and cuddle up in a corner and say I give up. But instead you should say, I have a huge mountain in front of me. I need to get some different equipment on my back, or else it's going to be a lot harder for me to survive. Is that kind of true?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is us looking at it in the aggregate. And just because the market's doing that doesn't mean that you have to. We're all playing in the same e-commerce space, but you're not necessarily bound to that market. It's not like a law, but it is like a general trend that we're seeing.
It's so easy to get lost in a sea of opinions, a sea of Twitter threads, and how I grew my business from 0 to 50 million in 2 days. And you'd be like, oh, wow, this is what I should be doing. But when we tell you, hey, this is what's actually happening at the macro level, data wise, you're like, oh, I'm not the only one experiencing this.
Yeah, it's definitely a great thing for some brands to take solace. Okay, I've struggled. What's going on? I'm running great ads. I'm working just as hard, and we're not feeling the ability to scale at this point in time. And you're fighting some headwind. A lot of brands are fighting that headwind, and that's what that consumer confidence is. When consumers aren't that confident, you're going to be paddling upstream.
What do people do with this data? How do they use it?
Be aware that as you're scaling spend, that you may experience an increase in CAC. It's going to become harder to acquire more customers as you try and acquire massively more customers. And two, to keep in mind that you will be pressing against some consumer confidence issues. It doesn't look like the consumer confidence is that high right now, certainly not for the numbers that have been reported. It's not dropping anymore, but it doesn't look particularly strong. So keep that in mind in some of the forecasting you do. It's important to be able to forecast because that's how you're going to base inventory. That's how you're going to base hiring. That's how you're going to know exactly where you're at cash flow wise. That's all extremely important, especially if you don't have billions of dollars to draw on.
As people think about what they want to do next, use this data. You get in the D2C index. If you're not on the free e-commerce data newsletter, like Steve is sharing insights like this on a weekly basis. And there's nothing more valuable to have than to know what is actually happening on the macro level. And I just want to acknowledge you again, Steve, for all the hard work that you've done and continue to do. Follow him on Twitter. We'll link everything in the description here. Anything that Steve is doing, you need to be a part of it, especially if this is a conversation that you enjoyed. Steve, is there anything else you'd like to add here?
No, thank you, Nate, for pulling me in here and having me sit down and talk about this.